Have you ever had that suspicious feeling whenever you see a brand new title by a well-known, respected gaming studio known for making some of the best games of all time, but now their newest release just feels kinda off? Like there's something missing from whatever this new thing is. Well, that's what I felt when I first saw the Avowed announcement trailer made by Obsidian, who are known for their work on Fallout New Vegas and Pillars of Eternity. This should have meant that Avowed was in good hands, right? Not exactly, because while it is true that it's from the same studio that made those games, it's not from the same people. So what it should really say is from the studio that used to employ the developers of Fallout New Vegas, because this is functionally a brand new title from a brand new studio. But funnily enough, despite all this, Avowed probably had one of the best media coverages that I've ever seen without any real merit to it. This was like that one time they tried to spin the narrative that Dragon Age the Veilguard was this generational masterpiece that we all should be praising like it's the second coming of Jesus.
Dragon Age the Veilguard refreshes and reinvigorates a storied series that stumbled through its middle years, and leaves no doubt in my mind that it deserves its place in the RPG pantheon. The next Mass Effect is going to have a very tough act to follow, which is not something I ever imagined I'd be saying before I got swept away on this adventure.
It's good to have goals in life.
Enjoyable action combat, a fantastic cast of allies with sweeping story arcs all their own, top-notch cinematics, and moving, nuanced character writing
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
are the wings on which this triumphant dragon soars.
Watch the wings!
Pulling out all the stops in a whirlwind tour of Northern Thedas, and capping it with a terrific finale that's built on memorably tough choices and consequences. If we never get another Dragon Age, at least it got to go out on a high note.
It was receiving 9s and 10s across the board, with games journalists making it seem like this title is one of the greatest video games of all time, and it should be considered to be on the same level as Elden Ring or Baldur's Gate 3. But then when I played the game for myself to see if the fanfare was really valid, I found that Veilguard was in reality a shallow and below average RPG that barely even respected your intelligence as an adult and had the same level of writing of a modern Disney movie. That's the gist of it, at least. If you want my fully in-depth review of it, you can find a link to the video down below in the description. Anyways, after playing Dragon Age the Veilguard myself, I came to the realization that it was nowhere near the 9 or 10 out of 10 title that the games journalists were clamoring so much about. The media just gaslit everybody into thinking that this game was way better than what it actually was. And I fear the exact same thing is happening with Avowed's news coverage. Avowed has reached 5.9 million players since launch. Avowed tops the bestsellers list on Steam. Obsidian is happy with Avowed's sales. All of these headlines led me to believe that Avowed was a critical and commercial smash hit. However, upon closer inspection, I noticed that these articles didn't say that Avowed had 5.9 million sales, just players, which could mean anything from deluxe version purchases to Xbox Game Pass users. And despite the seemingly high numbers, when I go take a look at the player count they boast so much about, it doesn't really reflect those figures. Because on Steam, it peaked at just 20,000 active players, and I'm aware that these numbers don't account for console users. But if Avowed was really the rousing success that these gaming publishers made it seem, then why is it that it peaked at 4 times less than Dragon Age the Veilguard on PC? And that game was considered a disappointment by EA themselves, even though they had about 1.5 million players in the first 2 months. So if Avowed had 5.9 million players, then why don't the numbers on Steam reflect that? Something isn't adding up here. I mean, Monster Hunter Wilds has just recently surpassed 8 million sales, and it boasts incredibly impressive Steam numbers to back up that statistic. So where are the players for Avowed? Does this game just have hundreds of thousands of mega fans on Xbox that no one knows about? Or has the media once again misrepresented the numbers and gaslit the public to think that this game was much better than it actually was? All of this media coverage seemed really sketchy to me when I first saw it, so I had to play Avowed for myself to see if it was really deserving of all of the positive reviews and extremely favorable media coverage. All to answer this one simple question: is Avowed a good game? Well, after spending about 40 hours playing through the entire game, doing every side quest, and exploring every inch of the maps, I can definitively say that Avowed is not really that great. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not a bad game by any means. It's certainly better than Dragon Age the Veilguard by a considerable amount. However, Avowed doesn't really do enough to make itself stand out from the rest of the RPGs on the market. And on paper, it has everything that you would want in a huge open world RPG. It's just that in execution, it falls flat in pretty much every aspect to the point where I was finding it difficult to justify the $70 price tag that they were charging. Avowed is simply not as good as the gaming news publications and staunch defenders on Reddit would have you believe. It is a completely mediocre experience that lacks any defining trait to set itself apart from the rest of the other games within the same genre. And to be honest, it's a pretty massive downgrade from Obsidian's previous titles like Fallout New Vegas and Pillars of Eternity. And it certainly doesn't hold a candle to other first-person RPGs like Oblivion and Skyrim, which both just completely blow Avowed out of the water, even though they're decades old. Now, there are some things that Avowed does get right, however those things come with a huge caveat, and each time it seemed like Avowed was taking one step forward, it took two steps back, like with its open world exploration. Which is weird because I thought that the exploration in this game was actually one of the better aspects that it had to offer. You see, there are 4, technically 5 huge open maps in Avowed, each densely packed with secret areas, points of interest, and of course, loot. Lots and lots of loot. It might just be me, but I'm the type of gamer that enjoys exploring every nook and cranny of these open world games. I like going off the beaten path in order to do some side content or find some cool item. That to me is why open world games are one of my favorite genres to play. So me running around each of the areas in Avowed and discovering all the little landmarks and finding every hidden loot box were the highlight moments of my 40-hour playthrough. It's clear to me that the developers took a lot of time and care into creating each of these large open areas and stuffing them with so many things to discover. And with the ability to mantle onto any ledge that you can reach means that you can pretty much go anywhere you want to in this game. And not only that, but you're encouraged to go out and explore because there are many hidden side quest objectives that are not visible on the map until you encounter them in the wild, and completing them could actually affect the outcome of some quests. For example, spoilers ahead, while exploring, I found this hidden cave occupied by the main antagonist group and I wiped them all out, then went about my day without a second thought. However, me doing that helped save the main town later on in the story from being raided by them, which I thought was a pretty cool touch. Exploration was easily one of the best components in Avowed, but unfortunately it does come with some caveats like I mentioned earlier. Although it was fun running around the map, discovering new points of interest, and finding all of the hidden loot placed around every corner, the problem with it was that the world itself felt really lackluster and, dare I say, soulless. And it's so puzzling to me too because Avowed had all of the ingredients to make a super interesting world. It has an already established universe because it's set in the same one as Pillars of Eternity. It already has pre-established locations with their own factions and written lore, and each of the characters seemingly already have backstories so you can get attached to them more easily. So why does it feel like it all falls flat at the end of the day? Well, it's because the world building was executed pretty poorly, and the result of that made the entire game a chore to trudge through. Avowed's world is, quite frankly, dull and uninteresting. Now, it's not the worst I've ever seen in a AAA title because games like Starfield and Forspoken exist, which have excruciatingly horrible open worlds. And to give credit where credit is due, the developers did handcraft each area themselves. However, Avowed's world isn't really that good either because there were no memorable locations or landmarks that ever caught my eye in my 40-hour playthrough. All of it felt like generic underground ruins number 83 or copy and paste swamp biome number 69. There were less than a handful of locations in this game that really felt like they were actually special or worth remembering, and that's because the lore built up around them was lackluster. For example, again, spoiler warning, the second town you arrive at in Emerald Stair, Fior Messeverno, doesn't really have that many noteworthy things about it, except that it's normal for the people to use necromancy to help with their agriculture. That's about it. Which is an interesting concept by itself, but unfortunately they don't go into detail about the practice and they never explore the moral or ethical ramifications of it. Hell, the companion that you get from this town that literally practices necromancy doesn't use it at all in her kit, nor does she really talk about it ever at camp. And this is such a big fumble with Avowed because they have all this lore and world building built up from the Pillars of Eternity games, but not much of it was implemented into the actual gameplay. It's all just flavor text that you see in a throwaway side quest or some random journal lying out in some random cave. What Avowed needed to do was to focus more on utilizing their vast plethora of lore and world building to create an experience unique to this game only. For example, spoilers for Baldur's Gate 3, if you don't want to listen to this, you can skip ahead. Anyways, in Act 2 for Baldur's Gate, you arrive at a town in the middle of a desolate wasteland called the Last Light Inn, and this place is one of the last beacons of hope to fight against the darkness that enveloped the land. And eventually, the place gets attacked by a horde of demons, and it's up to you to defend it. And depending on if you're successful or not, will determine whether the Last Light Inn stands or falls. Unfortunately, I was unable to defend the town, and because of that, the whole settlement succumbed to the madness of the dark energies. And all that remained of it were the corpses of the innocent townsfolk I had to slaughter in self-defense, and the regret of my failure. This was such a huge memorable moment in Baldur's Gate 3 because I watched in real time that my actions affected the world around me. And these unique interactions are what hook the players into your game and make them remember it even more. Now let's compare that to Avowed's version because they tried to do something similar but it just didn't quite have the same impact. Spoilers again for the Emerald Stair, but after you get far enough into the story, Fior Messeverno will eventually get raided by the main antagonist group, the Steel Garrote. And whether or not the town stands or falls is determined by if you found the secret tunnel the Steel Garrote were hiding out in and killed them all before they attacked the town. And based on that, the NPCs kinda just tell you outside whether or not the town was saved after the fact that it already happened. Yeah, you don't actually get to experience the attack itself. And that's one of Avowed's biggest fumbles, is that on paper, your choices do have an impact on the world around you, but you never get to see the consequences of your choices unfold before you in real time. It's a shame too because the choices you make do seemingly matter and could actually affect what happens in the story. Unfortunately though, the effects just happen off screen and then you're just kinda told about it in passing by some random nameless NPC. Then I'm just left wondering, why not let the players see it unfold in front of them? Video games are unique in the fact that it's one of the only entertainment mediums to combine interactivity, visuals, and storytelling. The reason why video gaming is such a popular medium is because it allows us to see the direct results of our actions in real time. We don't want to play a massive choice-based RPG only for the consequence of the choices to be done off-screen. Spoilers here once again. In the first area of Avowed, you'll get assassinated, however shortly after you'll get revived. And after you wake up, you make it your mission to find your assassin and bring them to justice. So eventually you find him and talk to him, then you're presented with a choice, either kill him or let him live. I chose to kill him, so the consequence of that choice was that his friends killed the guy that you met at the beginning of the game off screen. And you're told this information from a random unnamed NPC in passing, and his body is hanging from a random tree that's easily missable. I personally never found his body in my playthrough. I only know about it because I happened to see it while scrolling through Reddit. This choice had zero impact on me because I barely even knew the NPC that died in the first place, and it happened off screen, completely destroying the gravity of the decision. And this is only one of the many choices in Avowed that feel completely meaningless because you never have to reap the seeds of what you've sown. That's why Avowed's world felt so bland, and it's why I was never able to get attached to it after 40 hours of playing. To add on to this is the fact that there is virtually zero interactivity with this world. You can't really do anything to interact with your surroundings, and the NPCs don't even react to your actions. You can't attack NPCs, you can't manipulate the objects nearby, but you can steal the NPCs' belongings right in front of their faces. And as some people might have noticed, the NPCs literally do not move from their spot. They're all stationary like cardboard cutouts. Wait, my bad, that's not true. I did find one NPC that does move, see? So everyone making fun of the game for not having walking NPCs is just wrong because Avowed actually does have them. Checkmate, haters. Okay, but seriously, nothing in this game reacts to your presence or acknowledges your actions, which makes it feel more like a theme park where you can walk around and see all the pretty attractions, but you can't ever get on any of the rides. That's what it feels like. I understand that not every open world RPG needs to be this huge sandbox where you're free to do whatever you want like in Skyrim. In fact, I've enjoyed plenty of open world RPGs that aren't massive sandboxes where you can do whatever you want, like The Witcher 3. But the thing is that in The Witcher, the world felt alive because the NPCs reacted to what you did. You can't just steal stuff in front of their faces, and the guards will tell you to put away your weapon if you have it drawn out. It's not much, but the little things like this are what make it feel more like a living, breathing world, rather than a cheap Disneyland theme park with no rides. And by extension, the bland world building led to some painfully dull and forgettable characters that you're forced to interact with during the story. None of the characters had any memorable stories to tell or personalities that made them interesting. They all felt like cardboard cutouts that were randomly propped up around the game and only played their scripted voice line in the most stiff and robotic tone possible, especially the companions. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I can't tell you one notable trait about any of the companions in this game because each one of them were just so painfully uninteresting, from the personality to their design. It was like Obsidian copy and pasted Concord's character designs and said, yep, people are really gonna like it this time. Concord might have died really young, but for some reason Obsidian really wanted to keep it alive, so that's why we get these guys. You see, the problem with these companions is that most of them either have a surface level backstory that I didn't ever care about, or they just didn't have any sort of personality trait that would make them likable. It also doesn't help that the voice actors for every character in the game sounded like they were bored while recording in the studio. And I mean, since there are only 4 of them, let's go down the list of all the companions and what they have going for them. The first companion is Kai. Admittedly, I think he is the best one out of all of them, which isn't really saying much because the bar was already low to begin with. But it does seem like Obsidian put a little more effort into writing Kai because he does show some emotion from time to time. However, his backstory is like 2 short quests that take at most 10 minutes to do because they're the basic go to X and interact with the thing. Even though Kai is probably the best out of all the companions, he's still kinda boring compared to any other companion in any other RPG. The second party member you meet is Mori. No, Maurice? No, Marcy. No, what was his name again? Hold on, let me check my notes. Let's see. Marius. What kind of stupid name is that? Okay, so Marius, as you can probably tell, is the most forgettable out of all of them because he just looks like a no-name dwarf NPC that you would see in a corner of a tavern in World of Warcraft. This character was frankly just a waste of space. He had one quest for his backstory that was put into a single 15-minute dungeon. His personality was about as interesting as a wet napkin, and to top it all off, he's not even useful for open world exploration. There is literally no reason for you to ever bring this guy on your team, which reinforces the fact that this was a complete waste of a character. Next is Giada, and she's the stereotypical support companion, which is kinda lame because she had a bit of potential to be interesting. She's actually one of the few characters in the game that practices necromancy, but nowhere in her kit or design indicates that. It would have been way cooler if we had a support character who was like a necromancer. Imagine the possibilities you could explore with that concept. Instead, she just has generic support abilities that have nothing to do with her background. And speaking of background, she's one of the only companions where her main story is sort of integrated into the main campaign. However, the writers just kinda gloss over all the details and character building, so she's just kinda there. All we know about her is that she studies necromancy, her parents died in a freak accident, and that she was exiled from her hometown. That's it. Now the last character is Yahtzee, or whatever her name is, the purple furry gremlin. She just straight up doesn't have a backstory whatsoever, or at least not any that's told to you outside of optional dialogue. She just joins your party midway through the game and everyone goes along with it. It's so bad that near the end of the game, where all the companions have to face their past traumas and everything, she just doesn't have anything to face. And the writers literally had to pull out some random crap out of their ass in order to fill up this narrative void that they forgot about. What's also puzzling to me is that you're required to have her in your party at all times if you want to do any type of exploration, because she's the only one that can dispel the illusions littered throughout the world, which feels like a massive oversight from the developers. Like there's literally no other way to remove this stuff on your own other than to have her in your party at all times. Did no one on the dev team think of this glaring issue? Anyways, the point is that all the companions in Avowed seem like they were an afterthought because of how little effort was put into the character building and game design. I feel like if you went and asked ChatGPT to write you a generic fantasy D&D character, it would spit out a way more fascinating character than what Obsidian have given us here. It's just really bewildering to me because Obsidian is supposed to be the expert on crafting deep and expansive narratives with so much lore because that's what they've been doing for the past 2 decades. So I was really disappointed that the characters, and especially the companions in Avowed, were the weakest aspects about the story. And speaking of story, I can't really say anything good about Avowed's campaign. It was about as interesting as waiting in line at the DMV. And the supposed interesting story beats all felt like they were just lacking that extra impact to make it feel like these moments actually mattered. Because like I said before, your choices actually do matter in this game. There are consequences from the decisions you make. However, Avowed does such a terrible job at engaging the audience into their narrative. I mean, I guess it's cool that the devs added a lore feature during dialogue so you can read up on it in the middle of a conversation, but the game never really gave me a reason to care about it in the first place. One of the reasons why is because all of the lore is given to you through these long-winded dialogues and exposition dumps that made me just want to skip through it all. For example, whenever you had to talk to the god in your head, it always felt so obnoxious because she always spoke in this weird cryptic speech pattern that just went on for way too long, which got really annoying after having to go through it for the millionth time. And if it's not the long drawn out conversations that ruin the story, then it's the lack of any exciting story beats. Even until the end, nothing you ever did felt impactful. It was just like going through the motions for the entire game. What Avowed was drastically lacking were some memorable set-piece moments that gave the audience a reason why they should care about this world and its characters. I think there was like one moment in Avowed where I could maybe consider a set piece. This game was just severely lacking in the climactic or cinematic flair that you would normally expect from a AAA title. Now, I'm not saying that they should make something like the Bahamut fight from Final Fantasy XVI, although that would be cool, but at least have some immediate stakes to engage the player. Hell, even Dragon Age the Veilguard had multiple set-piece moments, and that game was a huge steaming pile of crap. Even at the final confrontation with the main antagonist of the game, did Avowed still manage to make it feel lackluster and flaccid. The final battle was literally just like 5 packs of enemies and then you fight the final boss, which was essentially just a reskin of another boss, but with some extra moves. It felt like there could have been so much more to this game, and that was probably one of the biggest letdowns that Avowed had. Okay, now that we've got all of that out of the way, what about the most important part about the game? The combat. Because all of this can be forgiven if the combat is good at least, right? Well, not really, because the combat is serviceable at best. Like, it's not bad, there is definitely fun to be had here, and it feels better than Skyrim or Oblivion's combat, but there's just not enough meat here to really sink your teeth into Avowed's combat for a multitude of reasons, but I'll get into those later. For now, I'll give credit to what its combat does best, and that is build variety. I really like the freedom that Avowed gave you to freely choose how you wanted to build your own character. You're never confined into playing a specific archetype or class, and you can freely incorporate any of the skills from each of the skill trees into your build to tailor it exactly how you want it. That also means that you can use any weapon type that you want to, because there are no requirements for equipping any of them, allowing you to switch up your weapon loadout freely on the fly whenever you like. Started out the game with a sword and shield? Well, now you can switch to a two-handed hammer 20 hours later. Don't feel like doing a two-handed strength build anymore? Switch to a sword and gun build using a mixture of fighter and hunter skills whenever you want to. Because Avowed allows for such a vast amount of freedom with build crafting, there's pretty much an endless amount of combinations that you can cook up for yourself. Now, that's pretty much it for the good parts about Avowed's RPG mechanics. The rest of it are not so great. Even though it's great that there is a wide variety of builds that you can play with, the build pool is kinda shallow. To start off, while the skill tree does look cool at first, you'll quickly realize that there actually aren't that many skills on it if you're not playing wizard. Like, half of the skills on the trees are just passives, and the other half are in the wizard tree for some reason. I know the devs probably intended for you to dip your toes into every tree, but I just wanted to do a non-magic build, and it felt kinda lackluster as a mostly melee dex build. To give you an idea of how bad it is, both of the ranger and fighter trees only have 4 skills out of 18 that are actives. The rest of the 14 are passive skills. I went through pretty much the entire game with only 1 skill because the others didn't really fit my build. Now, to contrast that with the wizard tree, which has 33 skills and 25 of them are active abilities. If you're doing full magic, then you've got a whole toolbox to play with. Meanwhile, non-magic builds get toothpicks and bubblegum. You wanted some cool melee skills? Well, too bad, buddy. You should have put some points into wizardry, because that's where the developers put all their budget into. But even then, the overall amount of choices on the skill trees were massively lacking, and it honestly made the whole game kinda stale. To add on to that, the gear system is also pretty pointless from what I've noticed, because most of the items are useless. You see, how the gearing system works is that there are 2 types of loot. Generic no-name equipment that gives you your standard stats, and unique equipment that gives you some special passive bonuses. The problem with this system is that the game hands out unique items like they're candy, meaning that you'll pretty much never be walking around with generic gear equipped. The only time is within the first few hours when you just started playing. Which brings into question, what's the point of trying to litter the world with a bunch of generic loot if we're just gonna end up selling them or salvaging them anyways? Picking up a purple weapon out in the open world is meaningless because they're literally everywhere, which by proxy makes opening the treasure chest out in the open world also meaningless because most of the time you just get crafting materials and money out of them. There is no sense of excitement or exhilaration or anything for that matter because 99% of the time you're never getting anything noteworthy. Avowed should have either made the unique gear way more rare to find or just remove generic gear altogether and make it so that you spend your resources to add modifications and enchantments to a few pieces of gear. That way, every piece of loot you find out in the open world would feel meaningful and significant. And if that means removing all of the random pieces of loot lying out in the open world, then so be it. It's not like they were exciting to pick up anyway. Now the rest of Avowed's combat is, to be frank, very lackluster. To start, the game is really easy, even on the hardest difficulty. I didn't really have that much trouble clearing out waves of enemies because they had an incredibly simple attack patterns and you could pretty much stunlock anything in the game, completely trivializing combat. This includes the bosses as well because they were so lazily done. Like I mentioned earlier, essentially every boss in this game is just a stronger version of a normal enemy. None of them had any interesting moveset or unique attack patterns, they're just your average enemy with much more health, which made boss fights significantly less exhilarating and more of a slog that you're forced to go through. Now I get that Avowed probably wasn't supposed to be a particularly hard game because it's obvious that the devs prioritized the player power fantasy over difficulty. However, it comes to a point where in order to keep up the power fantasy as the player scales through the game, the enemies will have to equally scale in difficulty. This is where games, especially RPGs, introduce brand new enemy types in order to shake things up and provide a more meaningful challenge in order to continue engaging the player. But unfortunately, Avowed falls flat on its face when it comes to enemy variety because it is just pathetically low for a so-called AAA game. You will legit spend the entirety of the game killing the same monsters from start to finish, no matter what area you're in. Like, why were there so many goddamn bears in this game? I went on to Avowed's wiki to see how many enemy types existed within the game, and there were only 11 different types. Which sounds like a lot, but when you consider that most of the humanoid factions have the same exact enemy types, then you'll realize that you've been functionally fighting the same mobs but with a different skin. So that's why it felt like I was fighting the same 5 enemies for the entire 40 hours. At the very least, what the devs could have done is given each faction a unique gameplay feature that separates them from the others, like making skeletons revive once after death, or making lizardmen be immune to magic. I don't know, just do something at least. Or add in elite mobs with special modifiers that either buff their allies or debuff the player. That way it'll feel like you're experiencing something different each time you encounter a pack of enemies. The devs could have done anything to alleviate the monotony of killing the exact same monsters the entire game, but they didn't. Even though Avowed is supposedly a AAA game, apparently they can't afford to add in more enemy types for some reason, killing what little enjoyment I had left of the title. Overall, Avowed is another victim of the mainstream gaming publications overhyping another title that is way less deserving than the praises that it gets. Now, don't get me wrong, Avowed is not a terrible game, nor is it even close to the worst one that I've ever played. But to be honest, it's not very good either. At best, Avowed is a mediocre title with serviceable gameplay and a decent amount of content to keep you playing for at least 40 to 50 hours. What really holds this game back though was the soulless and uninteresting setting that Avowed takes place in, the bland storytelling, the forgettable characters, the shallow RPG systems, the pointless loot system, and the excruciatingly low enemy variety. All this combined to make Avowed way worse than what it could have been. I didn't really have high expectations going into this title, but I still went in with an open mind. Maybe it could surprise me somehow. But unfortunately, the Obsidian we once knew is no longer here with us, replaced by a mostly different team of developers with a completely different vision. And I heard that they're now working on the Outer Worlds too, which after playing this game, I'm not sure if I should be excited or worried. But even after all this, if you still want to play Avowed for yourself, I'd recommend getting it on sale or playing it on Xbox Game Pass because this title is not worth $70. But that's just me. What do you think? Do you agree or disagree? Let me know down below and make sure to like, comment, subscribe for more content in the future. See you.